I was very moved by the answers that I would get from the scientists in the project when I would ask them, okay, so, how do we make the connection between, this glorious setting here and that messy, painful world out there? And that was my other universal question. If you put together a bunch of geniuses and you give them a bunch of money, are they going to make us safer, happier, and more collaborative?
My name is Sujin Pak, and I'm Dean of the School of Theology. And I welcome you to this evening of really a groundbreaking event. Tonight, we get a glimpse into the potential of data science to help make sense of intricate and complex dimensions of human life, particularly how computational social simulation might provide insights into religious extremism and its potential for violence. The School of Theology and Computer Data Sciences are honored to serve as co-hosts of this event, and my sincere thanks to Associate Provost for Computing and Data Sciences, Azar Bastavros. Thank you for partnering with the School of Theology. Our evening begins with a screening of Dr. Jen Lindsay's documentary film, Simulating Religious Violence. As you'll find out, this film tells the story of a Boston University professor and his colleagues as they seek to address the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing. After the screening of the film, Dr. Wesley Wildman will moderate a conversation in which we will have the distinct privilege to hear from the director of the film herself, along with three esteemed panelists, Dr. Yair Leor, Dr. Jimmy McCarty, and Dr. Laron Schultz. Thus, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Wesley Wildman as this evening's moderator. Dr. Wildman is professor of philosophy, theology, and ethics, and of computing and data sciences at Boston University. He is executive director of the nonprofit Just Horizons Alliance and chief scientist of the Center for Mind and Culture. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wesley Wildman.
Greetings. Lovely to see you all. The film you're about to see, Simulating Religious Violence, is entangled with the non-profit organisation Just Horizons Alliance. Now in its 18th year with a long history of close connections to Boston University, Just Horizons is a future preparedness organisation that recognises the unprecedented nature of our times and seeks to identify adaptive responses that lead us in a more just and hopeful direction. Just Horizons runs a publishing house specialising in adventurous spirituality for unconventional people. Its tech ethics venture created a pilot curriculum in AI ethics used right here in the Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences. And there's an entire class of folk who are being subjected to that curriculum right now. Thank you for coming tonight. It seeks to support virtue cultivation among tech-immersed young people and conversations among thought leaders about adaptive responses to our high-tech, secularizing world. Meanwhile, the research arm of Just Horizons, the Centre for Mind and Culture, studies adaptive responses to the exceptional cultural evolutionary niche into which we are transitioning, combining insights of humanities, social science, and data science experts. From the beginning, the problem of religious extremism capable of motivating and rationalising violence stood out as needing attention. After all, our technology creates weapons of unthinkable power that some religious extremists would willingly employ to devastate civilization if they could get their hands on them. Aiming to make a useful contribution first to scholarly understanding and eventually to policy reasoning, the distinctiveness of the CMAC approach was in integrating multidisciplinary thinking with data science tools, particularly computational social simulation and social network analysis. After some solid preliminary results, mostly theoretical in nature, because we were pretty short on data at the time, we attracted enough attention to land 10 years of high-level funding, mainly from the John Templeton Foundation and the Norwegian Research Council. Well over 100 people worked on this multinational effort to understand religious identity and change, to grasp the emergence and stabilisation of religious extremism, to come to grips with the way forced migration can sometimes provoke both anxiety and extremism, and to build computational simulations that help us understand the underlying dynamics and identify more peaceful pathways into the future. Jen Lindsay's film, Simulating Religious Violence, is based on work from the beginning of this decade of concentrated research. She courageously stepped in to document research activity that is never visually easy to capture, the scholarly intricacies of which are exciting only to egghead researchers. Ply Jen with a couple of drinks and she'll readily admit that she sometimes had her doubts about the wisdom of working with boring professors with no idea how to ham it up for her cameras. Right, Jen? Despite those difficulties, Jen found a way to tell a story about the power of data science methods fused with humanities and social science insights to address one of the urgent issues of our time. So without further ado, please enjoy Simulating Religious Violence.
And so we come together to pray and mourn and measure our loss. But we also come together today to reaffirm that the spirit of this city is undaunted, and the spirit of this country shall remain undimmed.
I actually was living in Oxford at the time, and I was having a dinner party that night and had a bunch of my friends over for the evening. I kept hearing my phone go off. It was ding, 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 ding. It was so annoying, and I didn't really want to bother myself as to why my phone was going crazy. I, went and checked my phone to see what all the sort of sounds were about. There had been a bombing in Boston during the marathon, and it gave me sort of a sense of helplessness. I felt, the day after the Boston bombing, that I needed to be doing more. I should be doing something about this. This is what I do. My contribution to the academic literature should not just be for the sake of pure knowledge. We can understand why people will bomb a marathon or bring down the buildings of the Two Towers or shoot up a nightclub in Paris or drive a truck into a Christmas market in Germany. And as someone who does modeling of religion, I can help to answer these questions so that we can better prevent these things from happening in the future.
Modelling in simulation is used all the time for everything. It's used to create new cars, it's used to handle flight simulators, it's used to build distribution routes, it's used to manage the economy, it's used for everything that affects you in your daily life.
This model has potentially predictive capacities to understand the future of conflicts, because what we're looking at are the causal mechanisms behind religious and ethnic conflict. If you can isolate causal mechanisms and the appropriate conditions under which religious and ethnic violence will occur, you can, in principle, predict it.
I have a Greek colleague from my university, Apostolos. He came to one of our public seminars about the Modeling Religion project and heard us describing the way we apply simulation technology to humanitarian problems. So Apostolos was planning a conference in Lesvos, Greece, an island that has been hit especially hard by the refugee crisis. So Apostolos suggested that our team come a couple of days early and actually visit the camps where the refugees stay after crossing from Turkey into Greece. It worked out particularly well because some of our modelers had already started working on a refugee model. So we decided to focus on refugees, radicalization, and integration.
We have thousands of people arriving. From May on, we have an increase of 500 people per day, and then we go to 3,000, even 8,000, 10,000 per day.
Can you imagine they can get 100 people in there?
Impossible.
There must be people underneath too.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they're jammed in. skin to skin. I mean, not only is there a gigantic, immense mound of life jackets, torn, ripped, some okay, a lot of them torn up. Some of them were faked life jackets, like they put grass in them to make them look as if they were life jackets, but they really weren't.
I mean, the scale of it is hard to grasp.
Yeah.
So I'm 6'2", and I'm looking like dead in the middle of that pile. So I mean, they have to be piled at least 12, 13 feet high here, and that's a smaller pile.
So now it's the end of the summer, it's August, and we're in Kristiansand, Norway.
They'll be arriving soon, and we have space set up for them here in Sørlandets Kunnskapsparken, here in Kristiansand at the University of Agder. We've got the time, we'll be working together for 2 days.
We are doing another workshop where all of the different teams are getting together to try and keep working on their models of radicalization, refugee integration, immigration, and hopefully going to try and finish some of them off while we're here. So this is the first time that we're going to be presenting as a team to not just local but also national government officials too, so that'll be cool.
The goal from the beginning for this particular public event, this colloquium, was to try to show to the university community here in my local university in Kristiansand and policymakers and collaborators we have here in the region, and a few colleagues who came from other places in Oslo and Europe, to show them what modeling could do, the way in which this particular methodology can link together theories and show possible causal connections and lead to policy implications in a way that no other particular methodology can do.
We have to overpromise to get more money, but we can't overpromise and have people pissed that we didn't solve problems. And we can't solve all the problems, but we're doing a better job than somebody who's not working on it. I mean, that's for sure.
I really tried my heart out. I really tried to make a difference. I did my best. And so I'm going to be able to look at myself in the mirror and think something other than you could have, but you didn't try. I'm not going to have that thought. Laurent, what was it like being pursued by Jen and her camera?
I enjoyed it, actually. I thought it was fun. She's often apologized to me for pestering me, but I never felt it that way. It was really, I mean, it's nice to get the attention, of course, but to have one's research paid attention to and taken seriously and transmitted to a wider audience, I mean, it's huge. Thank you, Jen.
You're welcome.
There's quite a bit of theory that went into the computational models and were covered in the film. Things like identity fusion and sacred values. These are very big theories that exist in social sciences. You don't need computational simulations to talk about them, but building them into computational simulations creates these agents that look a little bit more like humans because of their behaviours and their decisions. Staying with you just for a second, Laurent, how do you regard the effectiveness of the expression of these theories in the agents of the agent-based models that you built?
The effectiveness?
Yes, how good were these agents at expressing these theories?
Well, of the theories that we selected, I would say very good, very high. We had to, as Jen said, we had to abstract and decide which theories we wanted to focus on. But basically, we took the insights of a whole host of different theories and disciplines, psychological, social, evolutionary, economic, and so forth, and we tried to cull the most empirically validated evidence of what causes violence that's informed, at least, or justified by religion, and include at least those key factors and those key elements from all these disciplines within the simulations. So it didn't cover everything, but we felt like it covered at least enough to give a broad sense of the conditions under which it's more likely to happen.
Jimmy, the sorts of conflict resolution you talk about routinely deal with these incredibly powerful psychological things like your identity is fused with that of a group, and it's so difficult to get past that. Could you Could you comment on how important that is in understanding conflict resolution, and maybe even relate that to what you saw in the film?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes up regularly in conflict transformation theory that allows for folks to engage conflict differently, not toward violence, is often an ability to see one's identity in others, right? So right from the start, when you're thinking about identity fusion, it's which others are you thinking about, right? Others who you think of yourself as similar to, or others you think of yourself as different from, and how do you understand that relationship? So that stood out to me right away, like identity fusion. I want to know a little bit more about that as I think about kind of what's happening. But though we often act as if like religion is this special identity that people have. And so I want to know more about the ways that religion is teased out or distinguished from or in relationship to questions of ethnicity, especially of nation, of land, as it was broken out here. And I know you're not in the weeds on all of that in the documentary, so I can just kind of go from the narrative. But that's a question that stuck with me, right? That even Laurent says that at some point. Depending on how you define each of these words will change the way you answer this question. And so that's part of what I was wondering about as I was watching it, especially thinking about some of the conflicts that were highlighted. I'm thinking especially about both Syria and Northern Ireland, and thinking about those as, I'm not sure I would define them right off the bat as religious violence. So I just want to know more about that, as opposed to something like land or politics or something like that.
Jen did a good job, I think, of capturing the fact that people react to that puzzle of defining religious violence in complex ways. What the film seems to settle on, what is a researcher's consensus, that what they really mean is religiously motivated or religiously rationalized violence, not always both at the same time. It's very different than religious violence straight. Now, you've given a lot of thought to this, I think, Yair. How do you think about religious violence or other ways of interpreting it? How do you approach the definition of religious violence?
As for the exact definition of what religious violence is, I think it's that's a little complex. There was a kind of, at the beginning of the movie, Jen, there was this notion that the violence factor is not really about religion, it's about class, context. And while I understand that class and context are really important, I think that it would be a mistake to assume that the ideologies that we pursue, whether they're political or secular or religious, don't have a real bearing on violence. And so at the same time that we want to reach out and have integration and make sure that there's no xenophobia and that we embrace, a multicultural perspective, it's important to not sugarcoat things and realize that religion is a real factor in generating violence in the world, just like secular ideologies in the past, whether it's communism, fascism, and even democracies as well, certainly. I'm interested in, for me, it was captivating to see. I thought you did a great job in exposing, explaining what these models are actually doing. Both Wesley, Laurent, Justin gave great explanations without overextending the argument of being to do the kind of minority report prediction, precise predictions of what these models are supposed to do. So we know they're involved in weather and traffic and things like that, but you're presenting something way more complex here. That the idea that we can actually, with the computing power that we have today, we can actually look at societies, cultures, complex adaptive systems, and that's of great interest to me. The whole idea of how complex adaptive systems, living systems, all the way up to the most complex systems like culture, can be modeled and interpreted, and that's really something new on the horizon that will continue to be more and more prominent within our lives, these simulations. I'd like to see how that develops.
Jim, we're going to talk a bit about the method here for a moment. You encountered this method for the first time when trying to make this film. I mean, here we're talking about data science being pushed pretty hard to create artificial societies with these AI agents running around and interacting with each other. Did you believe it when you first saw it? Can you remember your first reaction and how it developed from there?
Well, Wes, when you called and you said, if I can figure out the funding, can you make a film about using computer modeling and simulation and apply it to the scientific study of religion? And I, like any good freelancer, said, yes, I can. And we got off the phone and I'm Googling what is computer modeling and simulation. This was the beginning of my journey. And this outsider's perspective was a great benefit to the storytelling, because I thought that the people watching the film someday, 9 years later, I didn't know how long it would take, would be asking exactly the same questions that I was asking. And I found through the conversations I had with people over the years around the story that I was trying to tell, that people actually would immediately, if they're in the humanities especially, or social scientists, they would become offended, actually, by the idea of modeling religion, because it just seemed so gauche, so crude, so arrogantly scientific, right? That you could make this video game and send people around and solve problems in the real world. It seemed like, these people in the ivory tower playing God, right? And one thing that I was very, I suppose, comforted by, and one thing that allowed me to really remain evangelical, I suppose, about the method to people I was explaining the project to, was you've all experienced Ross Gore. He's the guy at the end who's saying, well, we don't know if we're going to solve this problem, but, at least we're trying, right? We're doing better than someone who's not trying. And he had this humility, this modesty about the process that for me was a real touchstone of like, okay, you've got these guys who are incredibly bright with a good amount of research funding and this ambitious idea, and yet they had this commitment to remaining very systematic, very modest, not overstating their aims, not promising that they were going to, develop this minority report model. And I guess it was their modesty and their humility around their own aims that helped me trust that they grasped the complexity and the way that it might be misinterpreted from the outside, and the patience with their patience with people's impatience or reductive approach to their own project and the risks of it. So, Laurent and Wes and Ross and Saiku, they were always very careful to help me understand what was going on. And I also understood it wasn't my job to go into the granulated details of the methods that they were developing. It was my job to be able to represent their efforts to the outside world in a way that was digestible. And I hope I've done that. I always worry that I left something out or I put too much of something else in, but it's a conversation starter. Right.
Jimmy, I don't know whether you've had much to do with computational simulation before. I suspect not. So this might be an early encounter for you with this data science method. Well, why don't you tell us about what it's been like for you coming across it and starting to try and absorb it?
So I don't have much of a history with it. So I know what I know from the film. So thank you for that. And from conversations with you, Wesley. We've had some conversations over time. One of the things that stands out to me from case studies and trying to put together models of understanding the moments where it seemed quite likely that conflict would devolve into mass violence, and those moments where it didn't, was often very unpredictable, very context and personality dependent.
Yeah.
And so I kind of showed up with a little bit of a hermeneutic of suspicion for the seminarians in the room. Like, is this really possible to model that kind of lived embodied wisdom? But as I think the move, especially toward the end of the film, where the specifics of mass flows of migration, of refugee migration, as like an example of a case study kind of that could turn into instances of violence, was helpful for grounding, right? So like moving beyond the generics of religious violence, that was really helpful to look at what it might look like in like a real policy kind of question. But it also raised for me the same questions I started before around, well, what are we talking about here? Why is it religion as opposed to these other kinds of things? But I'll always have that a little bit in the back of my head. I wouldn't say I had offense, but there's this kind of like, there's something sublime in the spirit and the soul. What's going on here that we can kind of map that out, right? And so I just wonder about those things. I don't know that I'm dismissive of those things or even critical of them. I think there's ways this can be really useful, but I just wonder, it raises new questions for me about what it is that we're doing and thinking about when we're talking about religion as something that can be isolated or something like that.
Yeah, that's a beautiful set of questions. You're a systems guy. You think in terms of systems. You see religion and societies as forms of systems that can be understood using techniques that you use to understand systems, including computational techniques. But you haven't been that involved in computational simulation. So we've heard conflict transformation approaching computational simulation. What's it like for systems theory to approach a data science tool like computational simulation?
I think it's a kind of natural link. Because systems theory and complexity science take something so fuzzy and complex like culture and apply generic rules to studying culture, like a few fancy terms out there, self-organizing systems, system that self-organize. How do systems maintain their boundaries? How do systems process information and energy? This is the kind of things that we think about when we analyze culture. So it's very much amenable to a kind of scientific, generic pattern type of coding simulation. But me too, I'm skeptical. I feel like even the modelers in the movie are wondering, does this actually reflect reality? And that's an important fundamental question. So I had a chance to work with Justin on my dissertation, on my theory, and we tried to put it into a model. So I did have some kind of interaction. And at one point we realized that the agent-based paradigm that you're using in this movie, agent-based models are trying to see society as interacting agents and to code for those agents, and I must say in really sophisticated ways, in ways that one agent can change his values, it can change someone else's values, and it's also the environment impinges upon the evolution of their ideas. So these are really sophisticated ways to do things, but it's extremely hard to model the human cognitive architecture. Humans are unpredictable. That idea of rational choice theory, that humans are rational thinkers, kind of fell out of favor. We're very much emotional, unpredictable, erratic beings. So at one point, Justin and I pivoted to a different model, which is system dynamics model. And without going into the details, while agent-based models start with the individuals and individual interactions bubble up to general dynamics of societies, the system dynamic model does the opposite way. It's more of a structuralist, top-down paradigm. I was happy to see that today there's models out there and there's groups out there that are starting to embed the systems dynamic paradigm into the agent-based. So there's ways to make them complementary, and I think that move right there, what can we do about simulations? We can just try and make them better, and better and better and better, and that's one, I believe, very important step towards success. So.
Ron, you came to computational modeling and simulation from highly multidisciplinary ways of thinking, and I'm quite interested to know what it was like for you to rethink multidisciplinary ways of reasoning and knowing using this method. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So, because my training was initially in philosophy, and then slowly spreading out to other disciplines to try to make sense of different things that philosophy studied more broadly. So I was multidisciplinarity was always super attractive to me. When I discovered computer modeling, and it was an experience very similar to Jen's, I was part of a project, and I wanted Wesley to work with Wesley, and there was extra funding. So I said to Wesley, would you come and work with me on this project? And he said, I will if we can do computer modeling. And I said, okay. And then he went away, and exactly, I did. What is he talking about? But as I engaged with Wesley and learned what computer modeling was, you've heard the phrase of a mind palace, like philosophers have their own mind palaces. So computer modeling gives you a kind of scaffolding for your mind palace. So you can take psychology or sociology or economics or history or literature, whatever form kinds of knowledge that can inform what you're interested in and connect them to each other in ways that hold up an architecture and even a causal architecture that allows you to explore the connections between the insights from these different fields and disciplines in ways that just are not possible for the single individual mind, which is incredibly exciting and intellectually stimulating.
As a multidisciplinary thinker myself, I've become quite frustrated about the way lots of disciplines just talk right past each other. Social psychologists aren't talking to sociologists, they're not even talking to other psychologists. They're not talking to economists, and just keep on going down the line, religious studies specialists. All of these people with extremely useful forms of knowledge that are not touching one another. So, Naron, my impression is that computational modelling and simulation creates a venue for rigorous interaction so that people can't just make it up or pretend that something's relevant to something else. If they can't express it in the code, then they're not making contact. Could you comment on that? You've been so deeply involved in that.
I mean, this is true for me, but it's also been true for every one of the humanities specialists we've worked with, not just philosophers, but historians, anthropologists, all kinds of people. And initially, often, they're very suspicious, but if they stay in the room long enough and they find themselves forced to be really clear in a way that their students haven't forced them to, and often their colleagues haven't forced them to. And as they become clearer and clearer in what they mean, they discover their own theories in their own field and discipline in a incredibly powerful way. And they go away really enthusiastic about multidisciplinarity in general, and at least about computer modeling specifically and what it can do, recognizing, of course, its limitations as well.
Jen.
Wes.
This took a long time.
Indeed.
So you probably don't want to hear this question.
Tell me.
What would you have done differently?
I would have taken more of your research budget. Well, I taught myself how to make a movie with this movie, right? It was a great opportunity for me to, take this. I don't know what you had in mind when you asked me to try and do this.
Oh, exactly this.
Exactly this, right. Good. Well, actually, it started out as a docuseries because they had 2 meetings a year for 3 years, and I was like, 6 episodes, great. And I came out to the first meeting, and it was, I think, 3 or 4 days long of, panels not unlike this, in boardrooms. And I got home, and I made an episode, and then a couple of months later, I flew out, and they had the second meeting, and I filmed it, and I came home, and I cut an episode, and I showed it to my friend, and she's like, "Dude, this is really boring," and she said, if someone is not already interested in religion and computers, they're not going to be into it, right? And so I thought to myself, okay, so how do I drill this down to something that is engaging, a story? I'm a storyteller, social scientist, a filmmaker. And I happened across this wonderful book, Documentary Storytelling by Sheila Curran-Bernard. And she said, you have to think about the universal questions at the heart of your documentary story. And I thought, well, what are some questions that I have that other people might share that can touch on this story of this project? And one of them is, am I going to die in a terrorist attack, and who's doing something about that? That seemed pretty universal, right? So I thought that is something that could drive the story. And I knew that they were starting to develop the model of mutually escalating religious anxiety. And I thought, okay, so if I rotate the story around that question, that's already a hook, right? The second question, probably coming out of my tortured doctoral candidate mind at the time, was what's the point of all of this ivory tower blustering about theory? What are we going to do with all this? How do we bring this into the world? How do we make a pro-social difference? And I was very moved by the answers that I would get from the scientists in the project when I would ask them, okay, so, how do we make the connection between, this glorious setting here and that messy, painful world out there? And that was my other universal question. If you put together a bunch of geniuses and you give them a bunch of money, are they going to make us safer, happier, and more collaborative? And for me, the most powerful answer in the film is from Ross. Like, you know what? We tried. Wes says, I tried my heart out. I'm going to be able to look at myself in the mirror and say, I harnessed all the people resources and institutional resources I could, and we're moving forward. And it's a very ambiguous answer. It's in that delicious gray area of possibility. So what would I do differently? Maybe nothing. Here we are. Here we are. There's mocktails. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. But Laurent, I just want to know, this was from the early years of a 10-year project. And after that 10-year project, there have been a lot of other projects and a lot of other funding as well. So it's just been, our techniques are better, we're faster, we're bigger, we know what we're doing more, we're more precise, we've got better data, we're calibrating better, we're predicting better. Not just on religious violence. So my question to you is, what have we done lately?
Yeah, no, we've done a lot of projects. I think like that first Templeton grant was like 2 million or something, 2.5 million. Like probably between us, I think we've been part of over 90 million in grants, which for humanities scholars is a lot. Yeah. We've done models during the pandemic, of course, on the emotions and attitudes and polarization that played a role in people following regulations. We've done models on social cohesion in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We just recently, some of my teams did models of the West Bank and Gaza, the tensions there, working with the United Nations Development Program. We've continued to do work in Northern Ireland. We have European Union Horizon projects doing simulations of climate change mitigation across Europe, green transport, creating new protein sources from algae, all kinds of different sustainability-related projects. So one of the huge outcomes of the project that Jen has documented is this explosion of interest in the explanatory power of simulation to really shed light on and in some cases influence policies, or at least inform insights and policies related to really important problems in the world.
Thanks, Ron. Just one really concrete example. Did you know that childhood tooth decay is just a terrible problem? Some parents believe that that first generation of teeth doesn't matter because you're going to get another generation of teeth after the baby teeth, but that's not correct. The sorts of problems that affect that first generation of teeth can cause lifelong dental problems. And in a lot of underserved and undereducated environments in the United States, this problem of childhood tooth decay is terrible. So there's a question about what could you do concretely to save hundreds of thousands of children from having to deal with that problem for the rest of their lives. And it's just a single example from dozens and dozens of projects, but the particular model that we build to optimize outcomes based on communicating with parents is literally changing the lives of countless children. So it's just one example. It's what data science does when you put it together with humanities and social science and public health insights. Now, there must be questions or comments in the room about Jen's film or the issues we've talked about on this panel today. Do we have any hands?
As I see, a lot of the footage was shot in 2017, 2016. So what happens between like the shooting of the film and now why was it released not like 6-7 years ago?
So the production period, I was filming the project from Modeling Religion Project initial grant cycles from 2015 to 2018. The last part of filming was right in the Hyatt, right across the river somewhere. And then we got stuck in legal because as you see, I used a lot of news footage. So we had to deal with a lot of licensing issues. We had to collect appearance releases from everybody who passes on the screen. And I had to make sure that I girded the loins of the film so as not to be sued. And we had to have a crowdfunding campaign in order to get the color and the sound and all the stuff that goes on behind the incredibly complex team sport of filmmaking costs a lot when you're on a micro budget. So we actually me and my assistant producer Manu and also Danny who's here, we built a whole entire film production company around this movie, and we had hundreds of young interns working on it over the years, and that process also was a big management burden too. So I guess the answer is that if you're not working with like a big Netflix budget with professionals who push things through the workflow very quickly, it's much more of a painstaking process. And getting stuck in legal also was pretty slow.
I am one of those people who is inherently distrustful of computers and technology and computer models in general. So I was so appreciative that the story that you told in the film was so clearly a story about very decent people using everything at their disposal to try to help humanity. That was a very beautiful and pure story that came through. So my question is, what did you leave out to get to that story?
So much typing, Dan, so much typing. I'll continue. Yeah, actually, I also want to pass the baton to Laurent. Where I thought your question might be going is, what are the ethical implications of such a model that could be used for engineering a better society in the hands of someone who's defining a better society in ways that we don't collectively recognize here in this particular population? So the darker side, I mean, of this model is something that I think is really worth talking about. Now, I didn't have to leave out those, the Trojan horse or whatever conversations. There was nothing nefarious going on in the back rooms of the Modeling Religion Project. And did I get it on camera anyway? No. Kidding. Creating a 60-minute film out of 3 years of footage that goes to 4 different countries, it's a sculpting process. Ultimately, you hope it's engaging and it makes sense and it cracks open the nut of this, and it is a conversation starter that's useful for people. But surely there are some ethical risks that come with these sorts of tools. And so, Laurent and the others, I wonder.
Yeah, almost every time I ever present on this, we get a question related to ethics. So usually the first thing I say is that just like any technology, genetic engineering or nuclear power, it can be used for all kinds of things, for good or for evil. So the same thing with artificial intelligence generally, and with social simulation, with multi-agent artificial intelligence. So what we've tried to do is to say people are going to be doing genetic engineering, and they're going to be using nuclear power, and they're going to be doing multi-agent artificial intelligence. So let's get out there, out front, and try to drive the conversation to make it more ethical, to include as many people as possible into the discussions, a wide range of stakeholders, and to invite and push people to be honest and upfront about what their assumptions are going into the model and their purposes for using the model. So at least to surface from what's hidden out so that people can have the broader conversations about the ethical implications.
I have a
Go ahead.
follow-up question. Is the code available publicly, or are these things transparent?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
They are. If you disagree with something about one of these models, you can check out the code and decide whether it's expressed correctly. You can create a fork off a repo and change it yourself. Yeah.
Have you received feedback for improvement from other coders?
No, we've seen people branch in another sense. They create new models that are inspired by these models, but we haven't seen people criticizing any aspect of the model design. Jimmy, you must have thoughts about the ethics of this approach. Maybe we could hear from you about that.
Sure. I mean, one of the things I didn't get to in my first comment, but the question I actually am really interested in is around the defining terms is whose violence is counting here, right? So like we could look at the Syria example, and there's a way in which the story is kind of told as if it starts with the rise of ISIS and enforcing migration flows. But there's mention of the power vacuum that's created, which is basically the US-led war on terrorism, right? And we can think about multiple other instances where, just depending on where you start the story, whose violence is the violence and whose is the religious violence. And so that's something that just continued to sit with me as I watched the film about, you start with practical problems, you address them. Somebody works in conflict transformation. I get starting where we are and trying to move from the imperfect to something just a little bit better. I spend my life trying to do that. But the academic in me goes, so why is this the starting point of the violence in this region?
Yeah.
Or in this conflict? And why is it not one step back or another step back? And then whose violence is actually the violence, right? Or the religious violence. And so that was something, when I think about the ethics of the model, it's just like, where do you start the model, right? And so I don't know that I have a great answer for it, but it was sitting with me.
Yeah. I'll just say, totally fair question. Wesley and I have done models of the Upper Paleolithic, so we've started pretty far back.
Go ahead.
I love that.
I hadn't thought about this until today, but when you mentioned that you have models of the pandemic, I'm curious if you've done any work on the questions that many religious leaders are asking right now, which might lend themselves to models. Where's the church headed? And how can the church be most effective today in a time when many people are predicting the demise of Christianity or any number of faith traditions? How do we look at, it never occurred to me till this moment that perhaps computer models would provide very interesting information for faith leaders right now. Have you looked?
Yeah. Wesley, I feel like you should probably answer this, but the short answer is we have models. We've published models on exactly that, identifying the 4 conditions that are affecting secularization and the conditions under which different kinds of faiths can adapt to this new setting. But this was the model that Wesley came up with. So you want to say more about that one?
No, it's a wonderful question. For those of you in the audience who have a religious background, one of the really big concerns is what's happening to religion in secularizing contexts, because it's clearly declining, and if Northern Europe's anything to go by, it's going to become something more like the level of a hobby in a culture rather than the backbone of a culture. It's happened in many parts of the world, and it looks like it's happening in parts of the United States as well, especially some of the coastal regions. So there's a natural anxiety about that. Trying to understand how we get there, what the conditions are, is something that we've studied in depth. I would say that's our largest project since the Simulating Religious Violence project has been trying to predict and understand religious change and identity and what it means to have an adaptive response in a situation that we find ourselves, which is really unprecedented in the history of our species. So yes, the models exist, the insights exist, there are even some little films about it. So thank you, very good question.
Congratulations again, Jen. Great job. One of the moments that stuck out to me is the conversation after going to the life jacket graveyard where Saiku is like, I'm still processing, but this experience has made me kind of recalibrate how to frame the question or the problem. And it seemed like that embodied kind of experience of the team being in those really visceral spaces and seeing, like in front of them, the thing that they're trying to model. I guess I'm just wondering kind of can you speak to anything more about that comment that Saiku made? Because I'm just imagining, like, it's very clear in the film that there's a lot of self-awareness about this desire to step outside of the ivory tower and, an understanding across the whole team of like how complicated it is to do this kind of work. But I just kind of wondering like what were some of the things that couldn't make it in the film, but were coming up as, this like team of academics, computer scientists, religion scholars were seeing some of these really emotional, visceral sights before them, if that makes sense.
Ooh, that's a good question, Kendra. Thank you. Well, there we were in Greece, and I had arrived a few days before the team to do some location scouting. And as soon as I found the life jacket graveyard, I was like, okay, this is the money. I'm going to take them here. Somebody's going to cry. It's going to be awesome for my story. And because I had been struggling with their professionalism. These folks are at the top of their game. They're very efficient, productive, great friendly relationships. It's no good for telling a story, right? Conflict is the heart of storytelling. And I also had been studying quite a bit about how to convey character development in a documentary, and I was like, these people are not giving me what I need, right? So I have to push them into conflict. And one thing is that I realized in the process of studying that stuff that this film is not about these people as characters. It's the project that is the character that's being developed. And the protagonists are the vehicles for, this character unfolding. And so it's funny that you mentioned this moment with Saiku, because it was probably the rawest display of emotion that I got from any of the protagonists at any time. And there's always this part of me as a documentary filmmaker that also feels a little bit like an emotion vulture, like this voyeur being like, yeah, you're crying, let me get closer, But I guess a few moments in the film after he says, wow, this is really impactful, it's really deepened my commitment to this project to try and do something meaningful, he then says, however, it is very important that my emotions about this don't make it into the model. And that is a really wonderful moment, because those are the moments where you realize you can trust their work. That they're not so much more disturbed that that the model's gonna change, because they're still good scientists, right? And they know how to bracket their human experience from their highly specialized model building, right? So and it was important for me to bring the tension of those two moments onto the screen to help the audience understand that these are people modeling people, but they're also folks who are trained to be able to step back and have some critical distance. I will say, I think it's worth saying too, that I had some dissonance within me as a social scientist and as a visual storyteller, that the social scientist in me, thrives on complexity. And there's nothing more fun for me in the classroom where I can say, okay, trouble me this, why wouldn't a Muslim woman wear her hijab? Let's think about, how we equate this one simplistic image with, how people are like in the world. Whereas a filmmaker, I'm like, I need to represent a Muslim woman. Where's somebody with a hijab? And I have to go to the simplest thing that'll pack a punch and help people recognize a story point right away. So I'm constantly having to collapse my social scientific sensitivity into the somewhat gauche simplicity of the visual image, right? And I think that this is part of what makes filmmaking a modeling process, is you have to make peace with those abstractions and the ways in which you have to clear away the meaningful detail to get to the resonant point being made, even though then it becomes maybe less recognizable to the sensitive observer of humanity. So these are dissonances I tried to pack into the film, and as I'm watching it with all of you, I'm thinking, I can feel so-and-so's disagreement on this point, and thinking, okay, I'll return to this idea that this film is a conversation starter, and there's lots of spicy things that we can unpack, hopefully, ongoingly.
Well, thank you all. We're at the end of our time together, except for some final words by Professor Jimmy McCarty. And we've placed him in the middle of our panel here to express his important role here in closing us out. Thank you, Jimmy.
Yeah, and they're not my words, as is appropriate for anything affiliated with the School of Theology here at Boston University, the words of Martin Luther King Jr. They come from his Nobel lecture delivered on December 11th, 1964, so almost exactly 60 years ago to the day. And he says, "This evening, I would like to use this lofty and historic platform to discuss what appears to me the most pressing problem confronting humanity today. Modern man has brought this whole world to an awe-inspiring threshold of the future. They've reached new and astonishing peaks of scientific success. Humans have produced machines that think and instruments that peer into the unfathomable ranges of interstellar space. He's built gigantic bridges to span the seas and gargantuan buildings to kiss the skies. His airplanes and spaceships have dwarfed distance, placed time in chains, and carved highways through the stratosphere. This is a dazzling picture of modern humanity's scientific and technological progress. Yet, in spite of these spectacular strides in science and technology, and still unlimited ones to come, maybe like AI or computer modeling. Something basic is missing. There's a sort of poverty of the spirit which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The richer we have become materially, the poorer we have become morally and spiritually. We have learned to fly the air like birds and swim the sea like fish, but we have not learned the simple art of living together as siblings. Every person lives in two realms, the internal and the external. The internal is that realm of spiritual ends, expressed in art, literature, morals, and religion. The external is that complex set of devices, techniques, mechanisms, and instrumentalities by means of which we live. Our problem today is we've allowed the internal to become lost in the external. We've allowed the means by which we live to outdistance the ends for which we live. So much of modern life can be summarized in that arresting dictum of the poet Thoreau, improved means to an unimproved end. This is the serious predicament, the deep and haunting problem confronting modern humanity. If we're to survive today, our moral and spiritual lag must be eliminated. Enlarged material powers spell enlarged peril if there's not proportionate growth of the soul. When the without of man's nature subjugates the within, dark storm clouds begin to form in the world. And I just want to commend the filmmakers, all those involved with the project for trying to bring those things together in the Modeling Religion Project, but we still have so much work to do. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.